suncem rasti u jaslama dječjim, rasti i cvijetaj zemljoradni ljudi i neka mi ljudima vlada mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom
เข้ามาแทนที่ดินแดนแห่งนี้สู้ตีลังกาเรือน้ำลมและท่าแดงทั่วแดงวอนเสียสละสู่สนป่าแพร่ไปดีเขตปลอดภัยดีรักษาศักดิ์ศรีเวลาสามีไปในทั่วแดนลาวสู่นายามแลแดนแนวอิสลามผู้พาไปรอทงพนาเป็นนาอ่อนซ้อนดอกไม้สามซ้อนและทหารจงกินน้ำหัวสาทางหัวมีสีเสรีความสามัคคีเป็นพี่น้องเดียวต่อสู้และเดียวสร้างชีวิตใหม่เป็นมือความหวังสีสดใสเข้ามาแทนที่ดินแดนแห่งนี้สู้ตีลังกาเรือน้ำลมและท่าแดงทั่วแดงวอนเสียสละสู่สนป่าแพร่ไปดีเขตปลอดภัยดีรักษาศักดิ์ศรีเอราสามีไปในทั่วแดนลาว
Nel scovaggio che venne bruciato, ricolocaio un righe e sprig. Veniva tacio, un capotaggio, giocai i vesti in righe e sprig. Su Pagliarco, palazzo Terrie, in erba vecchia e d'oro. Oggi qua bimbi, e di Ferrato, e sono di un uomo.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome. We are here today with the latest in our series entitled Stalin on the Opposition. And we are here looking at the latest in this particular chapter, which is the report by Stalin to the 13th Party Congress of 1924. And this is, of course, a very important development because it marks the real breaking out into the open of the bubbling tensions that have been there throughout the period from at least 1921 up until 1924. And the issue at hand, which will be explored by us today, is, of course, the issue of inner-party democracy. And Stalin has much to say on that, and this is, of course, his contribution to the debates at the 13th Party Congress. Now, I want to start off by reading to you from the official history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, published in the late 1930s, written by Stalin, well, principally by Stalin, but I think there was significant contributions from Molotov and Zhdanov as well, at least. So it was officially accredited to the CPSU be Central Committee. But I think Stalin, Zhdanov, Molotov, and maybe a couple of others were the prime authors of this document. So this Congress takes place just after the death of Lenin. And I want to begin by reading a couple of things to you from the history of the CPSU. And I will start off with reading a excerpt from a tribute given by Stalin to Lenin just after he died, because there's going to be much discussion of Lenin's legacy and the Lenin enrollment in the party in this episode. So I think this gives us a good starting point and foundation to build off of. So Stalin, in his tribute to Lenin at the Second Congress of the Soviets, said the following: "We communists are people of a special mold. We are made of a special stuff. We are those who form the army of the great proletarian strategist, the army of Comrade Lenin. There is nothing higher than the honor of belonging to this army. There is nothing higher than the title of member of the party whose founder and leader is Comrade Lenin. Departing from us, Comrade Lenin adjured us to hold high and guard the purity and the great title of member of the party. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, that we will fulfill your behest with honor. Departing from us, Comrade Lenin adjured us to guard the unity of the party as the apple of our eye. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, that this behest too we will fulfill with honor. Departing from us, Comrade Lenin adjured us to guard and strengthen the dictatorship of the proletariat. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, that we will spare no effort to fulfill this behest too with honor. Departing from us, Comrade Lenin adjured us to strengthen with all our might the alliance of the workers and the peasants. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, that this behest too we will fulfill with honor. Comrade Lenin untiringly urged upon us the necessity of maintaining the voluntary union of the nations of our country, the necessity for fraternal cooperation between them within the framework of the Union of Republics. Departing from us, Comrade Lenin adjured us to consolidate and extend the Union of Republics. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, that this behest too we will fulfill with honor. More than once did Lenin point out to us that the strengthening of the Red Army and the improvement of its condition is one of the most important tasks of our party. Let us vow then, comrades, that we will spare no effort to strengthen our Red Army and our Red Navy. Departing from us, Comrade Lenin adjured us to remain faithful to the principles of the Communist International. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, that we will not spare our lives to strengthen and extend the union of the toilers of the whole world, the Communist International." Right. So, with that, you can really see why the Bolsheviks were frequently compared to the very early Christians. And you can see, I think, the way Stalin writes sometimes, particularly the repetition of certain phrases and the way that he writes. I mean, obviously, this is something which is translated from the original Russian into English, so perhaps there is something amiss in the translation, I don't know, but the way that feels to me, that feels like the kind of stuff we were taught in the way that it's written in our early Bible classes. So it's very much marked by, I think, Stalin's own upbringing, his early education in the seminary. But also, I mean, the comparison of the Bolsheviks to the early Christians is something which is probably worth bearing in mind, because similar levels of selflessness and self-sacrifice are required. And of course, whereas the Bolsheviks and the communists have mostly no God due to being atheists, God becomes the masses. And the relationship with God that is the hallmark of the early Christians, taking certain inspiration, I think, from the Judaic tradition, that relationship becomes a relationship with the masses, which means that it's a relationship with God is replaced by a relationship with the masses. And the way that a true Christian has his or her relationship with God, which is one that is lifelong, and which goes through periods of, shall we say, ups and downs, goes through periods where the faith is tested, goes through periods where you need to adjust to bring yourself closer to God if you're a Christian. Then, if we extrapolate that to and apply it to communism, there are moments when a communist's links with the masses might be weakened. There are moments when a communist might find his or her faith in the masses tested. There are moments when, indeed, if we go Old Testament about this, when the masses' faith in the communists might be lacking. There are moments when the masses might test the faith of the communists or put them through trials, just in the same way as the Old Testament God was fond of putting the early Christians, or shall we say back in those days, it would have been the Jews, through trials of faith. When the masses, as our God, put us through trials of faith, we must respond by bringing ourselves back to our fundamentals and reaffirming our faith in the masses. That, of course, in the manner of scientific socialism, is something which is and can be tested empirically. It is not a matter of pure faith. It is something that can be tested in the real world. But I think there are certain, perhaps, certain comparisons to be made with some validity between certain forms of religion and the early Bolsheviks, and of course us today, and to take certain inspiration from the way in which the Christian radicals, Jewish radicals in their early period had thought of their relationship with the Almighty. There are certain comparisons to be made there with how we regard, as communists, our relationship with the masses. So I think that's a very interesting thing to read there from Stalin. You'd never get that from Trotsky, by the way. Trotsky, most of his writings are about himself, as I know because I've read most of them. So we then turn to the 13th Party Congress itself. So reading again from the history of the CPSUB, we turn to what the purpose of the 13th Party Congress was. So we go about this in the following way. We will read the quote and then discuss as usual. So, quote reads as follows. In May 1924, the party held its 13th Congress. It was attended by 748 voting delegates, representing a party membership of 735,881. This marked increase in membership in comparison with the previous Congress was due to the admission of some 250,000 new members under the Lenin enrollment. There were 416 delegates with voice but no vote, which means you can speak, but of course you can't vote. The Congress unanimously condemned the platform of the Trotskyite opposition, defining it as a petty bourgeois deviation from Marxism, as a revision of Leninism, and endorsed the resolutions of the 13th Party Conference on Party Affairs and the results of the discussion. With the purpose of strengthening the bond between town and country, the Congress gave instructions for a further expansion of industry, primarily of the light industries, with placing particular emphasis on the necessity for a rapid development of the iron and steel industry. The Congress endorsed the formation of the People's Commissariat of Internal Trade and set the trading bodies the task of gaining control of the market and ousting private capital from the sphere of trade. The Congress gave instructions for the increase of cheap state credit to the peasantry, as to oust the usurer from the countryside. The Congress called for the maximum development of the cooperative movement between among the peasantry as the paramount task of the countryside. Lastly, the Congress stressed the profound importance of the Lenin enrollment and drew the party's attention to the necessity of devoting greater efforts to educating young party members and, above all, the recruits of the Lenin enrollment in the principles of Leninism. So the purpose of the Congress was, well, there were many purposes to it, but the overview given there in the history of the CPSUB shows us that the platform of the Trotskyites was rejected overwhelmingly, and the principles of Leninism were declared to be, of course, vitally important for developing the new, what's referred to as the Lenin intake. So we turn now to Stalin's contribution to the 13th Congress. Now, in his contribution, both his initial contribution and his response to the debate, he is focusing upon the challenges posed by the Trotskyites. And the challenges posed by them are, of course, all related to the issue of internal democracy. Now, you may remember back all the way in the first episode in this series, the purpose of that document written by Stalin on the trade unions was to counterpose the view of the majority of the party with the Trotskyite view. And the Trotskyite view back then was that the trade unions and differences with them should be dealt with in bureaucratic and administrative and military fashion. So what Trotsky's view on questions of internal democracy actually was changed depending entirely upon, well, what he required at the time. In 1921, he was in favor of using bureaucratic and administrative methods against the trade unions. And in 1924, he declared himself to be the defender of inner-party democracy against the evil bureaucrat Stalin. So we're going to go on to see exactly what that means during this. So Stalin starts out his contribution by talking about the concept of democracy, and it's here that he makes a number of interesting points, which I think it is worthy of us discussing further. So the first quote I want to read out to you comes fairly early on in his contribution. So you'll notice also, if you've read through this, that Stalin's actually quite funny in his responses. As he's making this contribution, because it's a recording of his speech, Preobrazhensky and others are interjecting, interrupting, heckling him, and he's responding to them in a very sort of quick-witted fashion. Interestingly enough, Trotsky doesn't appear at all as an interjector, an interrupter, or a heckler in this. Apparently, he declared himself to be very, very ill before this Congress, and therefore couldn't attend. But as Stalin points out later on in this contribution, he is writing things constantly, so he couldn't have been that ill. So, first point to make comes here, and we'll read the quote in full. I pass to the subject of how some comrades among us and some organizations make a fetish of democracy, regarding it as something absolute, without relation to time or space. What I want to point out is that democracy is not something constant for all times and conditions, for there are times when its implementation is neither possible nor advisable. Two conditions, or two groups of conditions, internal and external, are required to make inner-party democracy possible. Without them, it is vain to speak of democracy. It is necessary, firstly, that industry should develop, that there should be no deterioration in the material conditions of the working class, that the working class increase numerically, that its cultural standards advance, and that it advance qualitatively as well. It is necessary that the party as the vanguard of the working class should likewise advance above all qualitatively, and above all through recruitment among the country's proletarian elements. These conditions of an internal nature are absolutely essential if we are to pose the question of genuine and not merely paper implementation of inner-party democracy. So the point that Stalin's making there is that the opposition, and again this recurs over and over again throughout the history of the Soviet Union, frequently advances the slogan of we must have inner-party democracy, or we must have more democracy, we must have more freedom of criticism. Remember what Lenin said about that in What Is to Be Done. And what Trotsky and others, like his allies, Preobrazhensky and Karl Radak, who are mentioned by Stalin in his contribution here, are guilty of over and over again. And this was true later as well. This is true of the Khrushchevites, and this is true of Gorbachev. What they were all guilty of is presenting the term democracy in a wholly abstracted way, meaning that they were talking about democracy, but in, as Stalin points out, disconnected to the conditions that existed, that prevailed within the Soviet Union at the time, and also disconnected from the nature of the class struggle. and also disconnected in later years, particularly this was true in the Gorbachev era, from any conception of class politics at all. So what Trotsky, you find what he does, he and his supporters, and later on others like Zinoviev, Kamenev, and later Bukharin, who go into the oppositional camp, what they all start talking about is democracy. We must have democracy. But as Stalin points out, they never actually do a serious examination as to, well, what is the prevailing conditions in the country and in the party? And that's the point that Stalin's making here. You can't just have an abstract notion of democracy, which is divorced from class, which is divorced from the objective conditions that are facing you at any given time, which is what Trotsky refused to do, because, again, he wasn't actually interested in democracy. He was interested in getting his own way, for reasons that I will go into later. And there's some facts in what I will say later, and there's some elements of my own speculation. I'll clearly delineate to you which of the things I am presenting are facts and which of those are purely my own speculation and opinion. So, Stalin goes on to talk about, at great length, the nature of the problems facing the party and the criticisms made by the Trotskyites. Now he talks again, and he did this in the last episode that we did, the last piece of his writing that we looked at, about the difficulties facing the party in building up essentially proletarian democracy. So he says the following in response to this. The second obstacle to the implementation of democracy in the party is the pressure of the bureaucratic state apparatus on the party apparatus, on our party workers. The pressure of this unwieldy apparatus on our party workers is not always noticeable. Not always does it strike the eye, but it never relaxes for an instant. The ultimate effect of this pressure of the unwieldy bureaucratic state apparatus is that a number of our functionaries, both at the centre and in the localities, often involuntarily and quite unconsciously, deviate from inner party democracy, from the line which they believe to be correct, but which they are often unable to carry out completely. You can well visualize it. The bureaucratic state apparatus, with not less than 1 million employees, largely elements alien to the party, and our party apparatus with not more than 20 to 30,000 employees, who are called upon to bring the state apparatus under the party's sway and make it a socialist apparatus. What would our state apparatus be worth without the support of the party? Without the assistance and support of our party apparatus, it would not be worth much, unfortunately. And every time our party apparatus extends its feelers into the various branches of the state administration, it is quite often obliged to adapt party activities there to those of the state apparatus. Concretely, the party has to carry on work for the political education of the working class to heighten the latter's political understanding, but at the same time there is the tax in kind to be collected, some campaign or other that has to be carried out. For without these campaigns, without the assistance of the party, the state apparatus cannot cope with its duties. And here our party functionaries find themselves between two fires. They must rectify the line of the state apparatus which still works according to the old patterns, and at the same time they must retain contact with the workers, and often enough they themselves become bureaucratized. So this is a constant struggle which goes on to this day, which is that the party had to oversee a vast state apparatus all the way through the existence of the Soviet Union. And of course, in the early days, especially, this was something which had come from layers that weren't working class. A lot of the members of the state apparatus had come, in many cases, straight over from the old Tsarist period. And so what Stalin's pointing out here is that the bureaucratic machine has its own priorities and breeds its own particular form of mentality. And if the party is not careful, then the people assigned to oversee it and to make sure that it is conducting itself in a manner that is suitable for the dictatorship of the proletariat, they will end up being bent to the whim of the bureaucracy. And I will give some concrete examples as to how we can see the negative effects of this. The struggle in the later 1940s and early 1950s that often manifested itself in the Leningrad and Moscow party organizations was often found to be conducted over things like the content of economics textbooks. This is one of Stalin's last contributions, his work on the economy under socialism. And the reason why that is because Stalin saw bureaucratic problems creeping in and the problems of opportunism creeping in, which stemmed from the party essentially becoming more and more bureaucratized. And this was a problem in certain areas in the later 1940s. And it had increased during the Great Patriotic War. That because, as Stalin says earlier, at certain points, where especially if you're under siege and need to be making decisions quickly to best save the country and save the revolution, then there's not a lot of room for extensive discussion on proletarian democracy at that point in time. And so you end up with the apparatus making more and more bureaucratic decisions, which might be efficient and might still be good because it's part of a planned economy, but does breed a certain mentality, a certain bureaucratic mentality, and also starts to exert pressure on the party machine and lead members of it towards opportunism. And this is what ultimately plays a role in the creation of Khrushchevism. Khrushchevism, if you can sum it up in brief terms, is the manifestation of bureaucratic influence upon the CPSU, upon the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And this manifests via the search for easy solutions, the urge of the machine, as Stalin indicates there, to evade proletarian democracy, to avoid discussion, and to just make decisions efficiently. It also leads the bureaucracy to be in favor of things like market mechanisms, to be in favor of things like privatization initiatives, because these are seen by the bureaucracy. Even before we get into the question of the bureaucracy being a pro-capitalist force, overwhelmingly it's an opportunist force. That's what it is first. And so what Khrushchevism is the manifestation of the bureaucratic dangers identified by Stalin as early as 1924, and of course before him identified by Lenin. It's a manifestation of the real dangers of bureaucracy, which is that the bureaucracy gains too much power and that the party becomes bureaucratized and starts looking for shortcuts in policy making and implementation. Excuse me. And also starts looking for ways to declare that the class struggle is over. The bureaucracy always seeks to escape the control of the working class. And that is what is manifested in the Khrushchev period. Stalin always insisted, as he does in this contribution, that the bureaucracy has to be continually kept under the pressure of the working class struggle. The party cadres who work within the state bureaucracy have to be kept in touch with the masses. If not, then they become bureaucratized. And Stalin was very aware of that and fought against those tendencies right up to the end of his life. But unfortunately, those tendencies had advanced to the point where they had coalesced around an individual, the individual being Khrushchev. And so when looking at Soviet reformism, this is the way I would see it. It is a coalition between bureaucrats who, again, seek to remove the pressure of the working class and therefore seek to bring the revolutionary period to an end, to remove the pressure of the working class from the party apparatus and therefore from themselves. So that's a key component of it. The biggest component of that is the drive to declare that the class war is over, and that therefore any manifestation of class war inside the Soviet state has to be a manifestation of reactionary intrigues. And this, again, proves to be the agenda of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is all in favor of Khrushchev doing away with the dictatorship of the proletariat, bringing in his reactionary formulation of it being the state of the whole people, declaring that the class struggle inside the Soviet Union is over. It's all about pushing the working class out of the economic and political management of the state, and turning the CPSU from a party of the militant working class into a party that is purely about governing the state, but with the removal of the class struggle element, you turn it into a bureaucratized mess. And so, whereas a lot of people who got involved with the Khrushchevite tendency early on, many of them wouldn't have been counter-revolutionaries. They wouldn't have been people who regarded themselves as being enemies of the socialist system. But by going along with bureaucratization, by going along with the idea that the class struggle needed to be declared over, and that now we needed to build a state for all the people, what they did was, whether they meant to or not, they essentially slammed the door on the fight for socialism and entered into the process of capitalist restoration. Now, a minority of them would have understood that that is exactly what they were doing. There is a minority in the Khrushchevite tendency, a powerful and organized one, who knew exactly what they were doing, who knew exactly what agenda that they were pursuing, and knew how to go about it. Khrushchev was a tool in their hands. Many others who went along with it did so for various different reasons, but who weren't actively hostile to socialism, but went along with the machinery because of political weakness, of lack of connection with the masses, of bureaucratization of themselves. What revisionism really is an awful warning that you don't need to be a paid agent of US imperialism or an active traitor trying to restore capitalism to ultimately end up restoring capitalism. To this day, I don't think that Khrushchev was an agent of the West. I don't think he even really understood what he was doing quite a lot of the time. I think there were some shady characters around him who definitely understood what he was doing, but he was a pawn in their hands. If you look at Khrushchev's contributions between 53 to, when he was deposed from power a decade later, it waffles and wavers all over the place under the pressure of events. And you find this a lot with revisionists. There's no clear line that you can call Khrushchevism. The only clear line that Khrushchevism really is, the really real defining characteristic of it, is the wish to end or declare the class struggle in the Soviet Union to be ended, and to declare the dictatorship of the proletariat to be unnecessary, to declare that the revolutionary period is over, hence his attack on Stalin. And because he was probably of a mind to do some of those things anyway, and he was a senior member of the leadership already, this made him very useful to those genuinely pro-capitalist counter-revolutionary forces. Just as really, I don't think in the beginning anyway, even a character like Gorbachev actually wanted to destroy the Soviet Union, but he was very useful for people who actually did, people like Alexander Yakovlev and others. But the point being, and the central point here, the danger of bureaucratization was clearly identified by Lenin and by Stalin, and in the Chinese case by Mao and others, and was clearly identified as something that needed to be consciously struggled against. And you can tell a revisionist because they're the ones who come along and tell you that there's no need for any more struggle. Right, we will move on here to look at a couple of other things from this particular contribution from Stalin. So he goes on to talk about the inner party struggle and the contradictions of Trotsky. And Trotsky, as you will recall, if you watched the first few episodes of this series, the thing that defines him in the early 1920s is an appalling, arrogant, and ill-disciplined manner in everything that he did. He was always high-handed, always very bureaucratic in the way that he pursued his objectives, always just gave orders to people and expected them to be followed, always sought to create a cult around himself. And for this reason, a lot of people who worked with him couldn't stand him for more than 10 minutes. He was always a rabid egomaniac, and he always thought he should never be bound by party discipline. This is why you will recall at certain points he contradicted himself within often days or sometimes even hours. See, he would vote for things like the new economic policy. He voted for that as a member of the Central Committee, and then immediately afterwards started denouncing it, refusing to be bound by collective discipline, by democratic centralism. And this is something that Stalin goes on to mention in his initial contribution. So he talks about the fact that Trotsky commits a number of errors, and the biggest errors lie in the fact that he immediately contradicts lines taken by the Central Committee, even lines that he's voted for, by then writing articles and then putting them out there into the public domain, often in the press, denouncing the very thing he voted for the day before. In many ways, he sounds like an early period AOC. And in fact, they probably would have got on great together, because he wanted to keep his position on the Central Committee, which he couldn't have done if he'd have kept voting against and being in a minority. All these positions, especially in the Lenin period. But he also wanted to build up his reputation as the great and glorious leader of the opposition. So he kept trying to do both, and of course he always got caught out. So this led to a point where, because he repeatedly violated party discipline, Stalin says, well, then disciplinary measures need to be taken against him, because he's openly mocking the very nature of democratic centralism. So, I'll read the next quote, and it reads as follows. It means that Trotsky puts himself in open and outright opposition to the entire Central Committee. The party was confronted with the question, have we a Central Committee as our directing body, or does it no longer exist? Is there a Central Committee whose unanimous decisions are respected by its members, or is there only a Superman standing above the Central Committee? A Superman for whom no laws are valid, and who can permit himself to vote for the Central Committee resolution today and put forward and publish a new platform in opposition to this resolution tomorrow. Comrades, if we cannot demand that workers submit to party discipline, if a Central Committee member openly, in the sight of all, ignores the Central Committee and its unanimously adopted decisions, we cannot apply two disciplines, one for workers and the other for bigwigs. There must be a single discipline. Trotsky's error consists in the fact that he sets himself up in opposition to the Central Committee and imagines himself to be a Superman, standing above the Central Committee, above its laws, above its decisions, thereby providing a certain section of the party with a pretext for working to undermine confidence in the Central Committee, which is exactly what Trotsky is doing constantly. So he'll vote for something, and then he'll immediately release an alternative platform, despite the fact that, again, this is completely against party discipline, and he knows this because he's been told this over and over and over again. And this goes back all the way to the earliest years of him being in the Bolsheviks, when he was assigned with the task of negotiating the peace with the German imperialists, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. And he goes there, and instead of actually doing what the Central Committee has ordered him to do, he goes there, makes a speech, and says, we will sign no treaty with you, and walks off. And the Germans say, okay, fair enough, we'll just keep on attacking then. And so they ended up with a much worse deal with the German imperialists than they would have got otherwise. Why? Because Trotsky refused to accept an order that was given to him. And this happens so often, and it's the principal reason why he ends up being expelled from the Bolshevik Party and then expelled from the Soviet Union. He will never accept a democratic decision to be binding upon him. He will never accept that he's ever lost a debate, and he will immediately start scheming and plotting to overturn whatever source of authority has ruled against the great man. Now, bear in mind, what was Trotsky's criticism of Lenin when Lenin wrote What Is to Be Done? And when Lenin wrote One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, the One Step Forward, Two Steps Back was the Trotsky's response to What Is to Be Done. And Lenin wrote then Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution. And the criticism that Trotsky put forward of Lenin's work in What Is to Be Done, principally, was that, and now we'll quote directly from Trotsky here, that the party will substitute itself for the workers, a central committee will substitute itself for the party, and finally a dictator will substitute himself for the central committee. But then you look at Trotsky's actual record in doing things, And that's not Lenin's method, it's Trotsky's. I mean, if there was ever a case of psychological projection, it's here. Because as Stalin says, and we can prove this even from the work of Trotskyists, and they'll try and dress it up. Even if you go and look at the work of Ernest Mandel and his mini biography of Trotsky, or the massive biography of Trotsky done by the Trotskyist Isaac Deutscher, or the work of Tariq Ali, you'll find that they all admit that Trotsky lost all these votes incredibly heavily, but always refused to accept it. And you do reach a point where you start to look at this and think, well, why is it that he can never accept that he's lost? But not only just not accept that he's lost. If you can be steaming mad that you've lost a vote and still think you're right. But if you value the progress that is being made in the establishment of socialism in the USSR, you wait and you patiently work and you try and overturn the decision at the next available opportunity. Now, we end up turning a little bit to Trotsky's temperament and his mentality, which is, of course, he came from a very petty bourgeois background. His family were landowners. His uncles were incredibly rich businessmen, often with quite extensive links to the Tsardom. And so, given that that's his background, you can understand the petty bourgeois mentality. But a lot of other Bolshevik leaders did come from the Russian petty bourgeoisie, like Alexandra Kollontai. Came from a petty bourgeois background. I believe her father was a Tsarist military officer. And she lost several internal party debates in the early 1920s. She then left this sphere of politics and went into a career in the Soviet diplomatic corps, a very distinguished career in the Soviet diplomatic corps, which ended up with her being ambassador to Sweden and running Soviet intelligence networks in the Nordic countries, and being such an important and valued advisor on foreign policy that Molotov kept her on as a special advisor even after she'd been forced to retire through ill health. Up to the end of her life, she was still an advisor to Molotov. So that's somebody who was one of the original leaders of the Bolshevik Party just after the 1917 revolution, lost votes early on over the trade union issue, and she was part of the workers' opposition, accepted that she'd been part of a losing faction, and pursued a life that would aid the revolution, and was very successful in that. You compare her, who was also from a petty bourgeois background, to Trotsky, and you can see it's a complete diametric opposite. So is it the case that the man was just purely an egomaniac, a man whose ego was so colossal that he could never accept that he'd been defeated, and never accept any single vote that went against him, was always, even before the 1917 revolution, was always walking out of and wrecking organizations? Is it just that? Is it just the poor politics and ill discipline that come from being a petty bourgeois? The answer is, well, it's probably not. There were plenty of others who were like that, who came from similar backgrounds, but who adapted themselves to work in a disciplined fashion. And you look at the behavior of Trotsky, and the fact that later on we will see he starts repeatedly calling for the overthrow of the Soviet government, and the fact that he lied constantly to all of his followers, had very shady sources of funding throughout this period, in fact, throughout his life, all the way up to the end. And you have to come to the conclusion, ultimately, that there was something else going on here. It's not just a case of a rabid egomaniac who he thinks he's entitled to inherit the Soviet Union, which is what a lot of his followers argue. There is a strong argument to say that he was, or at least he had, a very interesting relationship with various foreign intelligence services and acted as a provocateur for them at various different stages, all the way up to the end of his life. Certainly, I think it is the case that someone like Grover Furr, the historian, has proved pretty comprehensively that Trotsky did have ties to the fascist regimes, to later the Nazis, to the Italian fascists, and also to the Japanese fascists. And also, earlier on in his career, he had ties to British intelligence. So I think it's beyond just being a crazy petty bourgeois who cannot accept ever losing a vote. There is obviously a significant section of Trotsky and Trotskyism that is motivated by that. But I think there has to be the case now that when you look at just how much disruption and wrecking behavior and sabotage he and his acolytes engaged in the end, you have to conclude that this was being done on somebody's behalf and not just him. And when Stalin lays it out, the fact that he got away with an awful lot, did Trotsky, in the 1920s. Like, he got away with violating party discipline over and over and over again. And as we see later on in this discussion at the 13th Congress, he got away with not attending to his duties as a Central Committee member, because every Central Committee member had to be part of other committees that were overseeing certain bits of important work. And Trotsky, because he regarded these assignments as beneath him, refused to do any of them. Even his backers, even people like Tariq Ali, who, if you're British, you'll probably know, he's a sort of mainstay was on Radio 4 and Channel 4. He's one of the founders originally of the Channel 4 television network, long-time Trotskyist, long-time editor of New Left Review. Even he and Deutsche, Trotsky's biographer, admit that Trotsky would not pay attention in Central Committee meetings if the matter under discussion bored him, that he would sit there apparently reading French novels and not paying attention to the contributions of anybody else. And it's like, either this guy is such a crazy egomaniac that he's incapable of working with anybody else, partially true, and then when you get to the fact that he engages in so much conscious wrecking behavior, then you have to come to the conclusion that this is action on behalf of somebody else. This isn't just an ego run wild. This isn't just poor politics. This is active intervention on behalf of some other party here. And I would speculate that that other party at this stage was probably the British. Later on, it's the Nazis, it's the Japanese, and towards the end of his life, it's the Americans. Towards the end of his life, Trotsky is trying to gain a visa to the United States, and to do that, he's promising to, he gave testimony to the Dies Committee, which is the forerunner to the House Un-American Activities Committee. He offered to give up all information he had on third international operations in Mexico. He offered to rat out as much information as he possibly could on the Mexican Communist Party. And he had people within his ranks who were openly calling for the defeat of the Soviet Union by the Nazis. So this isn't just a mistake. This isn't just bad politics. This isn't just a case of a petty bourgeois radical who could never accept that he'd lost a debate. No, this man's an agent. The more I read about it, the more I am absolutely convinced that this character called Trotsky was on somebody's payroll or another, or maybe multiple people's payroll. I think at this stage, it's probably the British. And he had a relationship also with the notorious British spy, Sidney Riley. A lot of this you can find in a very good podcast related to Trotsky's intelligence agency links. I think it's called Program to Chill. You can find it fairly easily, presented by a guy who calls himself Jimmy Fallon Gong. Is an American communist who presents this information on that program. And you check it out. A lot of it is very easy to verify that Trotsky had this long-standing relationship with characters like Sidney Riley, the notorious British spy. He had family relationships with people who were in the inner circles of the Tsardom. He got money from mysterious sources that were never fully accounted for, not like Stalin and his good old-fashioned revolutionary acquisitions via bank robbing. So it's not, I think that the more I read this, it's like there's no way that somebody who was a sincere and dedicated revolutionary would do the things that Trotsky did. And if you look at it, he got away with a lot up to his final expulsion from the Soviet Union. As Stalin says here, like over and over again, he refused to do the work of a Central Committee member. And like, you can't keep getting away with that. You can't have a rule for Central Committee members and a rule for the workers. It's not going to work like that, as Stalin points out. So, moving on then to the question of youth and experience. Stalin makes a good point in passing when he talks about the how you can't have like these absolute rules with regard to youth and experience. You can't say that youth is always better, like Trotsky does, because as I am personal evidence of, as in-person evidence of, youth gets misled quite easily in its enthusiasms. I was a Trotskyist for many years, for God's sake. But also, Stalin makes the point that, as he says, not every old person is someone we must respect. Points out there's such a thing as incredibly bad experience. He says that the German Social Democrats have very old and experienced cadres, and those cadres are old and experienced at suppressing the working class. So it's never just the case that you can say, oh, youth is the future, or we must stick by the old cadres. It's like, no, what is the youth bringing? On what basis are we bringing them in? On what basis do we defend the old cadres? Are they experienced? What kind of experience do they have? Is it the right experience? Is it experience which is going to benefit our organization? Is it going to benefit our building and sustaining of a relationship with the masses? And see, more and more, when you look at Stalin's work, as with Mao, as with Lenin, you see that he has a properly dialectical, all-encompassing approach to each question. He never just falls into cliches or truisms like Trotsky does, like Bukharin does. I was trying to say, like, youth is the future, or defend experience at all costs. No, it's like every single question, as a Marxist-Leninist, Stalin looks at the entire connection of relations around the question before coming to an answer. He investigates the question thoroughly before coming to an answer. He doesn't go for cheap one-liners or easy answers, as Trotsky does. So a couple of other things to point out. Now, he makes what I would call a very devastating response to Trotsky's claims that the only reason why factional groups are rising in the party is because of the bureaucratic regime instituted by the Central Committee. Now, I'll just read this excerpt to you. Trotsky affirms that groups arise because of the bureaucratic regime instituted by the Central Committee, and that if there were no bureaucratic regime, there would be no groups either. This is an un-Marxist approach, comrades. Groups arise and will continue to arise because we have in our country the most diverse forms of economy, from embryonic forms of socialism down to medievalism. That in the first place. Then we have the NEP, New Economic Policy, that is, we have allowed capitalism, revival of private capital, and the revival of the ideas that go with it. And these ideas are penetrating into the party. That in the second place. And in the third place, our party is made up of three component parts. There are the workers, peasants, and intellectuals in its ranks. These, then, if we approach the question in a Marxist way, are the causes why certain elements are drawn from the party for the formation of groups, which in some cases we must remove by surgical action, and in others dissolve by ideological means through discussion. So the point that Stalin's making now, again, is fairly self-explanatory. He's talking about why different factions emerge. And again, this continued to be the case. And again, this is why the class struggle continues and is absolutely necessary in the building of socialism. You still had, as Stalin says at that stage, capitalism present in the Soviet Union via the NEP. So you have capitalist relations which create certain ideological trends within the classes. You have survivals of medievalism even at that stage, because it's still in the 1920s. Collectivization and industrialization haven't been carried through yet via the 5-year plans and the collectivization of the land. You then have the emergent socialist economy as well. And so this is why all these different ideological trends emerge in the party and then in the wider society as well. And this continues to be the case because, again, the Bolshevik Party and then later the CPSU is made up all the way up to the end of workers, of peasants, and of intellectuals. You get this continual need for ideological rectification. And so, as Stalin says, sometimes you need to surgically remove certain elements from the party. Sometimes certain elements are so rotten and so far gone that they can't be preserved. They need to be thrown out, so that their presence will not only pollute the party. And this is something which I think Mao understood and tried to enact. And it's something that later, of course, Khrushchev is very keen to block. He's keen to bureaucratically marginalize or expel his enemies, the revolutionary wing. But he's keen to defend the bureaucratic wing. at certain stages. Later on, he panics and tries to move the bureaucracy around, and ultimately that doesn't work either, because again, he tries everything he tries to do, he does in a bureaucratic and an administrative fashion, never in a manner that involves the working class. So the point that Stalin's making here is that, look, drawing from Lenin, and Stalin always draws from Lenin, going all the way back to what is to be done. Sometimes the break needs to be made with a certain group in the party. Sometimes a certain group or a selection of individuals needs to be just flat out kicked out. Sometimes you can resolve the differences via ideological rectification, but you always need to be prepared to actually make the split, or kick them out. Because otherwise, and this is what Lenin is always railing against in what is to be done, if you have like a force in the party putting forward an alien class position, an alien point of view, that is allowed to just sit there and fester, and you don't deal with it, then you are going to end up with the party decaying and corroding, just as the Soviet Party did when it didn't have those internal debates anymore, when it didn't have the active involvement of the masses, when it allowed bourgeois ideological trends not just to grow, but to fully manifest themselves. And in the end, all that Gorbachev needed to do was to lift the ban on groups being actively pro-capitalist. All these groups were already there. They'd already grown up inside the CPSU. Gorbachev lifting the restrictions just allowed them to come out into the open and finally enact their plan to restore capitalism, and at which point Gorbachev was no longer any use to them. So again, like, this is Stalin saying correctly that communist parties need to be prepared to purge themselves of alien class influences. They need to be prepared to confront problems and to try and ideologically resolve them by actually going through rectification campaigns. And if that's not possible, then to expel people, sometimes in large numbers. And not to be afraid of that, or to be afraid of the confrontation that will ensue. So, the other points that Stalin's making in his contribution here, and in his reply to the debate, he's mainly focused upon the question of inner-party democracy. And again, this comes back over and over again. He repeatedly makes the point about the fact that Trotsky doesn't actually carry out his duties as a Central Committee member. He keeps coming back to that. And again, like, even Trotsky's defenders will admit that that is true. So the point that he emphasizes as he makes his contribution and he replies to the debate is that what's going on here is that the opposition keeps presenting its demands for democracy in a completely abstracted fashion. And again, I'll conclude on this point. The same problem keeps recurring in each generation in the CPSU. And in Stalin's time, they broadly successfully deal with it, though obviously not fully successfully by the end. And it always comes back to this, that a petty bourgeois grouping emerges, which is sometimes ultra-leftist, and is sometimes rightist, and is sometimes a merger of the two. But what it always demands is the following. It always starts off, as Trotsky is doing here, by screaming about the need for democracy now, without wanting to rip off Amy Goodman, or maybe I do. We need more democracy. We need more ability to dissent. That, again, despite the fact that Trotsky gets away with an unbelievable amount of dissent far beyond party rules for a long, long time, by dint of the fact that he was carrying with him a certain amount of often justified prestige from his quite legitimately skillful construction and commanding of the Red Army, which, funnily enough, was when he was put in a position where he could essentially run things military style and was allowed largely to do what he wanted. At that point, he proved himself quite useful. But again, there are differing interpretations of Trotsky's time in the Red Army, some of which are favorable to him, others of which claim that his reputation as the great leader of the Red Army are wildly overhyped, and that a lot of what was done was actually down to others, and that he was just the guy making the speeches on the platform. But either way, at the time he held a lot of prestige with him, and a big reputation. So he got away with an awful lot. But what he and his faction kept demanding, essentially, was the right to be ill-disciplined, was the right to permanently dissent, to form factions, to permanently campaign against the line of the party, to not be held by discipline at all. That's what they keep asking for. And again, this is the reason why they're very easily able to merge with, later on, Zinoviev and Kamenev's group from the, broadly speaking, the center of the party, though they flitted between like various different factional points. And later on with Bukharin and Rykov of the right. And what they all demand, basically, is the right, so-called, of themselves to go into perpetual opposition, to not be bound by collective discipline, to not be bound by party decisions. And again, this later on becomes the rallying cry of the so-called dissidents in the Soviet Union later on. And it helps them, and it helps the imperialists, that Khrushchev has essentially declared an end to the dictatorship of the proletariat and essentially is trying to move the Soviet Union, later Brezhnev does this to an extent as well, towards essentially bourgeois rule. And the more they push towards bourgeois rule, the more the so-called dissidents are strengthened, the more the reactionaries are strengthened, the more the ability of the party to act in the manner that it should act as the enforcer of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the more the party and its disciplinary methods are defanged by so-called human rights concerns, etc., the more that it is pushed towards essentially the party becoming disempowered, because this is what the imperialists always demanded and what their internal allies demanded, which is that the party essentially be relegated from rule, that rule be taken over by an enlightened minority, and we'll call that democracy, which is exactly what happened under Gorbachev. Nothing he ever did to destroy the Soviet Union could be described as democratic at all in any sense. And later with Yeltsin, who ran essentially as a Pinochet-type figure or a front man for various different comprador interests to destroy what was left of the socialist system. And all of this is described as democracy because to the bourgeoisie it is. But this is always what the demand of the opposition was in the Soviet Union. From the earliest possible days, it was a demand for from the intellectuals to be, or certain sort of, shall we say, counter-revolutionary elements in the intelligentsia, to basically to be in permanent opposition, to be allowed to be in opposition and to be celebrated for it, and to never be held to account, because that's always a demand of petty bourgeois reactionaries in the intelligentsia, and the demand that they shouldn't be held to account by workers. Because that's another thing that Stalin covers in this particular contribution of his. He points out that there is people within the opposition who complain that they're being held to account by drivers, chauffeurs, and peasants. Chauffeurs is the example that he gives, that there's people that people from Trotsky's group are complaining that there's people in the disciplinary mechanisms of the party who are workers, and how dare they try to hold to account the great followers of Trotsky. Again, this is what a lot of so-called dissident thought in the Soviet Union comes down to, which is, I as the great intellectual am tremendously important. How dare I be held down by these pig-ignorant workers? And again, it's there from the very beginning. And of course, they try and dress it up in terms of, well, we're concerned about democracy, we must have the right to dissent, we must have free speech, etc. What it comes down to is the fact that there are various petty bourgeois groupings that keep emerging in the Soviet Union to varying degrees of strength, and always, when they're defeated, refuse to accept it. Or if they can't accept it, then they just move over into outright terrorism, as Trotsky's followers did in the 1930s. And so the 13th Congress represents the culmination of this first period of struggle against the Trotskyites. And it is a resounding and massive defeat. And it's a massive defeat that is brought about by the fact that the party has been significantly purged and then proletarianized further via the Lenin intake. And this is something that Stalin and the other leaders keep talking about, the need to keep instilling Leninism into the new intake and making sure the party is kept on a proletarian basis. Because if it's not immersed and embedded within the masses, and it's not a militant party of the working class, then it is nothing. And so, 13th Party Congress marks the defeat of the first period of struggle against Trotskyism, And next week, we'll be doing a more famous work from Stalin, which is simply entitled Trotskyism or Leninism. And that's become a quite famous pamphlet circulated long after the death of both men. So join me this time again next Sunday for that. And we'll now turn to questions and comments. Okay. Right. Just going to ban somebody who's quite an obvious bot. So there we go. All right. Here we go. We have a lot of comments coming in here. We have 172 of you watching live. Thank you for that. So hello to Svetlana and Nejat and Grassy Knoll and Otis and President Jesus from the eternal dictatorship of Gavin Newsom. He will live forever, for he feasts on the blood of the living. And we have Abtin joining us, and we have RVA Klavik joining us. I believe you're coming to us from Detroit. Abtin is enjoying the Vietnamese song. Good evening to Jerry, and good evening to Jenny joining us from the land of the United States of America. And we also have James Graham with us, and we have Maro Mind with us. And we have Arseny Shizov, who says, watching from Kazakhstan, the only British colony that's not even aware it's a British colony. Well, the British imperialists have been quite successful over the last 30 years in Central Asia. We got a pretty firm grip on Kazakhstan. It's going to be interesting to see how that works out. Don't worry, though. We'll try and collapse British imperialism, so it won't be a problem for you much longer. They also have a firm grip over Azerbaijan as well, that was established in as early as 1994, when Haidar Aliyev signed a deal with Margaret Thatcher, who was over there as an envoy, to sign over a significant amount of the oil and gas industry of Azerbaijan over to British Petroleum. So the British have a strong hold in Central Asia and in this, the Southern Caucasus. Not that you'd know it from looking at the British press, but there you go. And Jenny is right. Stalin did indeed have a great sense of humor. And yes, Tony Blair is very heavily associated with Nursultan Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan. He spent a lot of time over there and made a lot of money over there. Harold says, they talk about democracy, which doesn't represent the interests of the working class, who are the great majority of the demos. Well, the bourgeoisie don't consider the working class to be human, for a start, and they don't consider them to be part of the demos. As Arseny points out, the bourgeoisie still have the Greek view of things, which is that they are the citizens, and therefore the democracy is for them. Everybody else is a slave. Stalin indeed, says Svetlana, had a very good sense of humor, often cracked jokes. There is a book one can buy in Russia of Stalin's jokes. If somebody can translate that, I will happily pay for an English translation. Jeremy joins us from a sweaty New York to give you an indication of what, I'm sure you've found the page by now, Jeremy, but the 13th Congress report starts on page 49 of the copy I was on. Right. We are going through this, and hello to Albert. We have correspondence going back and forth in Cyrillic. Okay, Harold's telling us a joke from Stalin. Actually, I will read into the record. Stalin is sitting in his cabinet with his assistant. The phone rings. Stalin picks it up. It's Roosevelt. No, says Stalin. No, after a moment. No, he says again. Yes, he says finally. The assistant says, Comrade Stalin, you disagreed with everything Roosevelt said, but you finally agreed on something. What was it? Stalin says, the connection was good. That's a good one. Right. Abtin asked the question, did Stalin's leadership help move the USSR inadvertently towards Khrushchevite revisionism? What can we learn from this? And Svetlana asks, given that after Stalin things began to deteriorate dramatically, what provisions can be put in place to prevent a similar thing happening in a future socialist state? Is it even possible? It's possible. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why things deteriorated rapidly after Stalin's death. I think that the ideological struggles of the 40s show that there were problems. I think a lot of the problems came from the destruction in World War II. It's not just the case that the bureaucratic elements were strengthened by World War II, they were, but also that a lot of the best rank and file communists had been killed. The communists are always the first to volunteer and often the first to die. So a lot of the best cadre communists had died. And those who were left were, especially in leadership roles, were untrained some of the time, the younger ones, and weren't able to properly see what Khrushchevite revisionists were doing. And I would say that certain things that the revisionists did were quite clever in that they drew from a lot of elements that had been discussed in the Stalin period. So, for instance, the 1936 Constitution talked about talked about political rights. There was talk about restoring rights to those who'd lost those rights under the repression following the Civil War, and there was the talk about overcoming class differences in the Soviet Union. So when Khrushchev came out with his crap about a state of the whole people, he was able to point to things that had been said and discussed in the 30s. But of course, what he did was he ripped them out of context and distorted them. So there's that, and that's always going to be a problem. I mean, the biggest problem, though, and the reason why he was able to get away with it, and the reason why he was able to get away with it in a quite crude fashion, following the 56 so-called secret speech, was that the party, I think, had been weakened too significantly by World War II, and its strength hadn't been rebuilt properly, and that the bureaucracy had been strengthened, I think, through the Great Patriotic War. And Stalin was aware of the problems and was trying to lead a struggle against it. But again, he also lost people like Andrei Zhdanov, who I think was, if Stalin had successors in mind, he would probably have been one of them. He was somebody who was waging a struggle against revisionism in the Comintern as well. So you have a series of problems, and you have, of course, the massive external pressure of imperialism weighing down upon the socialist bloc. You have the continual aggression of the US imperialists in Europe and elsewhere. And so revisionism is able to emerge, and I think this is, to go back to what I said earlier, about the fact that revisionism is never just an alliance of straight out-and-out traitors. They are in there, undoubtedly. There's, in every revisionist clique, there's a group of compradors, liquidationists, just out-and-out agents of US imperialism. They are in there, but they're not the majority. The majority are people who've been misled, who have been misguided. And so when Khrushchev, and I'll give you another example of how Khrushchev was able to get away with the things that he did. When Khrushchev talked about building peaceful coexistence with US imperialism, he was using a phrase that was originally Lenin's, which meant that the USSR would not act out military aggression towards the imperialist-ruled countries. In return, they would expect that there would not be open military aggression towards them. Khrushchev took that and twisted it to say that basically we must achieve peace with the imperialists at all costs, including making all kinds of concessions. Same thing Gorbachev did. Now at the time, and again, you read more into this, you discover that Khrushchev was constrained. For instance, he was forced to send the tanks in to crush the fascist rising in Hungary in 1956. And he was forced to do so partially by internal opposition and even inside his own faction, and by Mao. This is prior to the Sino-Soviet split. So Mao basically said to Khrushchev, no, you have to crush this, because this is a fascist rising. Khrushchev didn't want to do it. He wanted to let Hungary basically slide into total counter-revolution. He wanted to do what Gorbachev did 30 years later, but was forced into acting the opposite way. And because even then, even within the clique that had gathered around him, there were people who didn't want to see, who wanted and thought of themselves as socialists, who wanted to continue what they saw as the socialist project. But a lot of these people weren't very politically well educated. A lot of them were quite weak. A lot of them didn't have proper links with the masses. And so you ended up with a more and more bureaucratized leadership. So I think it's a combination of things. There were things in the Stalin period which led to the Khrushchevites being able to do what they did. And Stalin, I think no one was more aware of the problems facing the USSR and the party than Stalin himself. But Abtin's question is a pertinent one, and there is much more to say on that. But in terms of things that we can put in place to answer Svetlana's question, look, there's indications that we can take from the Mao period in China, which is that the crucial factor is that the machine that we are aware that the bureaucratic machine has dangerous tendencies within it. The bureaucratic machine that we will need to build an early workers' state, even now. And we know that the dangers that of bureaucratization and what that can lead to now. And we know that the actual way around it is by making sure that the party is rooted in the masses, but also that everybody is kept connected with the masses. Like one of the things the Cubans did, and it's in Che's period as Minister of Finance, was that they would have even people who were like very important figures in the party and the state. They'd go out and they'd do like weekend labor to be amongst the masses. You also can do sort of some administrative things, I think, to keep people immersed in the masses. You make sure that the salaries of the officials don't go too far ahead of the proletariat. You make sure that especially the party members remain living amongst the working class, that they don't become separated from the working class. So if you're a party member who's working in the state bureaucracy, you have to go home every night and go back to a working class area and be amongst the workers and learn from them, to draw from Mao. So there's various political and administrative measures that you can take to ensure that the party remains connected to the masses and to ensure that the bureaucracy remains at least under control and not becoming the corrupting influence it undoubtedly has done in various socialist countries. Jonas, if you says or asks, if I had to guess, the big setback for the Soviet Union was the fact that the majority of the young, well-educated youth was simply killed in the war. Yeah, it was a whole generation of militant communists were killed off. That was a big problem. Yes, Jonas, I am the only moderator here. I may have to take on more. Given that the chat's becoming more populated, I will make a note of that. I have binned the bot concerned. Harold says the Western intelligence services offer many incentives for people to just outright lie about the USSR, and I have met a few people who openly told me that they did so. Oh yeah, there's always been a lot of money in defecting and lying, or just writing histories that are straight up lies. You can make a lot of money doing that. Jeremy asks, was Trotsky popular within the party? No, he was popular in certain aspects of the intelligentsia, because that was where his roots were. But within the working class, no, he wasn't at all. That's why he lost all the votes at the party congress overwhelmingly. Marrow Mind says, what are your thoughts on Trotsky's book on the history of the Russian Revolution? Is it worth reading? If not, then what book on the Russian Revolution is worth our time? I've read Trotsky's book years ago. I wouldn't say it's particularly worth reading. I would say this one would be the one to start you off. History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, including, of course, the history of the revolution itself. Very easy to read, very concise history, and that's a good starting point. Jack says Trotsky had handlers. Oh, I bet he did. Trotsky's house in Mexico City is a literal fortress with turrets and all. Yeah, somebody must have been paying for all that. Svetlana says, according to pro-Stalinist Russian historians Yuri Zhukov and Evgeny Spitsin, Stalin the bank robber is a myth promoted during Perestroika that was taken up by Western historians with great gusto. Well, that's a shame because, you know, if Stalin was a bank robber, I think that's pretty cool. Yeah, as Jenny says, it doesn't make Stalin look bad. It makes him look awesome. Svetlana says, I think Stalin may have been involved in the handling of the loot, but he never actually took part in any of the bank robberies. For one thing, according to the historian Spitsin, Lenin wouldn't allow it. For the record, Evgeny Spitsin is the #1 Stalin historian in Russian today, also a member of the Communist Party. He's all over YouTube, although his own channel was banned last year. I'll have to see if I can get one of his videos translated. I'm just trawling through the... Yes, maybe I'll try the Yandex browser to answer Arseni's point now. Okay. Well, I may launch a takeover bid for Democracy Now, Abtin. I mean, to be honest, I mean, I was thinking, and now we're venturing into sort of show administration territory. I mean, I used to listen to Democracy Now a lot when I was an undergraduate. When I was like in the Iraq War period, I used to admire Goodman and Gonzalez, to be honest. But they, of course, completely lost the plot, took a lot of money from, I think, Soros-related forces. Can't be sure about that. But certainly it's the case that they went off the rails. So I was thinking I could probably, if I expand this operation at some point, then could turn it into a Marxist-Leninist version of Democracy Now. Do like a 5 days a week, 2-hour news show. But that would mean recruiting about 5 or 6 more people, and there's not the budget to do that at the moment. Cheesy says, why are there no Bukharin parties? Well, there are Bukharin parties, they're just not open about it. The CPSU became essentially a Bukharinist party under Gorbachev, or its leadership did. Deng Xiaoping was a Bukharinist. So the Bukharinist parties, I mean, you could argue that the Tito-ite Yugoslavia became Bukharinist. Bukharinism isn't popular with the masses, though. Now, Trotsky, he gains a following post-mortem because he's sold as a romantic true revolutionary. You can't sell Bukharin that way. You know, he's by the end of his life, he's a bureaucrat and a pro-capitalist. The only people he appeals to are people like Deng Xiaoping. Glad you're enjoying the series on Stalin, Steve. Scrolling through comments here. What do I think of Vanessa Redgrave? Asked Albert. I don't. Funny story. I ran in an election many years ago in a constituency which Vanessa Redgrave previously ran in Manchester. Vanessa Redgrave and her brother, Corin Redgrave, were members of, if you don't know who they are, I know we've got people from numerous locations around the world watching this. The Redgraves are like acting royalty in Britain. Michael Redgrave was Sir Michael Redgrave, Knight of the Realm, very long-standing theatre actor and film actor, and his children, Vanessa and Corin, have both been very, very well-established stage and film actors. Corin Redgrave and Vanessa Redgrave joined Jerry Healy's Trotskyite cult, the Workers' Revolutionary Party, in the 60s, I think, and got up to all kinds of things. Vanessa Redgrave, I think, put up the money to buy the WRP a house in the edge of Whalley Range in Manchester. Google the where Whalley Range is, you can find it pretty easily. The WRP used to run a centre there. It's a house on the edge of Whalley Range. I'm trying to remember the road now. It's near to Alexandra Park. Yeah, and the WRP owned that. I think that the Redgraves put up the money to buy it. It was their centre for years. I haven't walked by it for years, but last time I was over there, it was still all abandoned and overgrown. So clearly ownership was a bit of an issue because the property developers wouldn't have let that go. So yeah, great actress. Interesting choice of political organization, to say the least. The WRP were one of the worst Trotskyite cults in Britain, led by a genuine madman who is Jerry Healy, who's on a par, not quite as crazy as the politics of Lyndon LaRouche, but cult-wise built a very similar cult to Lyndon LaRouche. And in fact, apparently LaRouche learnt a lot from him. Read Settlers. I've read it. It's shit. Try another one. Dylan joins us from the People's Republic of Wales. Good to have you here. Lurtis says it would be great. It would be reeling back there. We hear a lot about Khrushchev and Gorbachev. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on the Brezhnev period. You know what, Lurtis? I will make a note to come back to that period. But I think what that is there are things to be learnt from it, to respond to your point, because there are struggles going on inside the CPSU at that time. The problem with them, because there are people trying to oppose the pro-capitalist slide, and Brezhnev's kind of hovering over it, bouncing between the various different factions. The problem is that none of them were able to mobilize the masses. None of the revolutionary who were still in the party were able to mobilize the masses in a way akin to Mao's mobilization of the masses in the Cultural Revolution. Because to actually stop the rot in the Soviet Union by the late 70s, it would have taken a cultural revolution to reignite the working class as a militant force in society, which is what the tendencies in the leadership of the Soviet Union in the Brezhnev period were desperate not to do. But we will return to that. Albert says, I know the chap who did the work on that house. Excellent. Svetlana says, I met Vanessa Redgrave briefly on Hampstead Heath. Lovely smile, very friendly, dressed like a scarecrow and smoking a rolled cigarette. Lovely and eccentric. Yeah, she curtsied to King Charles a while ago, or Prince Charles as he was then. Jerry says, in the early 70s, my brother's school economics teacher used to send him out distributing WRP pamphlets. Yeah, I would say you couldn't get away with that now, but given that the WRP probably had an interesting relationship with the state, you probably would have, they probably can get away with it now. Vanessa Redgrave stood up for Palestine at the Oscars. She was forcefully panned. Yeah, she did some good things, certainly. The WRP, took some positions that weren't awful, just that their overall line was terrible because they were being run by a cult leader. Right, and yes, to reiterate Jenny's point, but you shouldn't read Settlers, because Settlers is a piece of third worldist garbage, probably distributed by the FBI. It's one of the worst books I've ever read. Crude to the point of, it's almost like written like a daub on a toilet door. These kind of things are a barrier to the building of a serious communist party inside the United States. So avoid the politics of that book at all costs. Right, okay. So I'm going to draw the stream to a close for this evening. You will be able to find the audio of this on Patreon tomorrow. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and buy me a coffee, so you make possible what is done here. Thank you very much for your assistance. And you will find us again in the next part of this series at 7:30 p.m. on Sunday of next week. Thank you to everybody who's contributed to a very interesting chat as usual. And one day we will replace Democracy Now! Thank you and good night.